we will switch over, but not entirely in many ways, because in this series, and today of course is the last one, as you know, we've started out looking at the American defense budget with Professor Aaron Karp. We talked about Russia, we talked about China. There are tremendous challenges out there for the United States, and the next few years will be critical as to the direction in which many of these challenges will develop. So it is only fitting that we close off this series, which we started with a look at the United States, with another look at the United States, to look at the future of American foreign policy. Aaron Karp is known to many of you, and so I will dispense with introduction in the interest of time. He is my husband. He is a professor at Old Dominion University, and he is my kind of default option whenever things go wrong. Like last night when we didn't know whether we could actually connect with Dr. Stein today, I said, Aaron, I might need you tomorrow morning. So we got up really early, went to the office and put a presentation together for you all. Please appreciate his presence today.
As Gina said, it was a pleasure to start this series and to be able to present to you then talking about the American defense budget. It's been a busy week. A lot's happened. Since I made that presentation. If you want to follow up on some of the themes from then, I'm very happy to do it in the questions and answers. I'll try to leave a bit of time here. But really what I want to do is speak much more generally. What's the future of American foreign policy going to be all about? What's going to happen? In particular, how is America going to think about the rest of the world? That's where I want to go. And I can think of no better place to start it than with Emanuel Leutze's painting from 1851, which, believe it or not, is a painting all about America's relationship to the world. It's an ambitious work. And it begins this idea that America has different ways of dealing with the world. America doesn't have to do foreign policy, after all, or certainly didn't through most of its history. It works. There's the bigger version. It was a small country. It was weak. It was isolated with two enormous oceanic moats. So America didn't have to deal with the world for most of its early history. We didn't have foreign policies, really, except intermittently. Every now and then we do it, and then we go back to normal. We got used to that. The world, however, was paying attention. Leutze's painting has been criticized by historians who can nitpick it endlessly and correctly. It's not perfect painting, but it is very deep in the minds of everyone in this room. Everyone knows that painting. You know the basic ideas, of course. This was that extraordinary day. This is early in the morning of the 26th of December, 1776. Washington is gambling everything. He is gambling his life, he is gambling his army, he's gambling his cause. He doesn't know if this is going to work or not. But he's made a decision, and Leutze captures this absolutely brilliantly. Off they go. So he stands there, determined, not knowing what's going to happen. Directly behind him, anyone know? Alexander Hamilton, his aide-de-camp. Most of the people in the painting are known. All the major military heroes of the Revolution, well, most of them are in the scene. They were part of the crossing of the Delaware, and it worked. It didn't end the revolutionary struggle. That went on a little bit longer. But the ideas of the revolution begin to expand, most profoundly in the French Revolution, of course. Leutze is doing his painting not in response to the American Revolution. It's not really what he's painting. Points often been made, the scene bears a little bit more resemblance to the Rhine River than it does to the Delaware, which is true, because Leutze is in Germany painting this. He's not painting the American Revolution, but events that happened 75 years later, the revolutions of 1848 in Germany, liberal revolutions, based upon the American concept that Washington had personified. America, it turned out, even without trying, had a foreign policy. The world was literally watching and learning. And America was gaining a sense as well of what its role was going to be in the world. Like I say, this painting affects you. Of course it does. And it leads to these enormous questions. How are we going to interact? What's that going to look like? This is just a lithograph from 1872. It was basically a piece of calendar art, edgy in several ways, technically not that great, but it conveys an American relationship with the rest of the world. In this case, though, they're not traveling to the east. That's where Washington was going. This is traveling west. This is dealing with the great American problem of the 19th century, continental conquest. Part of the reason we didn't do a foreign policy, we were busy. We had another project that was going on. It was totally overwhelming. It was understood by the people that were leading it to be an innocent project. How does America engage with the world? Innocently. It is essentially harmless. Now they know that there are other things going on, and the lithograph actually includes them. There are these other people who are already there. How are you going to deal with that? There are big problems that are going to be caused. There is a darkening shadow there that you have to creep into. That's going to affect you as well. We're not creating a foreign policy, but we are creating an attitude towards the world. What really creates American foreign policy, the first big step came in 1898. It's the war with Spain. For the first time, oh, sorry, I'm leaping. No, here is America engaging with the world. Not in terms of foreign policy, but creating ideas, rather, that shape our overall attitudes and expectations. Why does the rest of the world have a different attitude towards the United States than it does to other countries? Part of it is because this country is very flexible. What are we going to do tomorrow? That's always been hard to predict. And it's a very powerful country that's hard to predict. But also because of the ideals. Abraham Lincoln is not primarily concerned with what the world thinks. He has other issues to deal with, obviously. And yet he comes up with something amazing. A statement of American ideals as he begins to apply them to the battlefields of the Civil War. The Lieber Code is a revolutionary document that says that war is not without rules, that we don't cease to be human beings because we're sometimes acting in a bestial way. Rather, we begin to apply the same ideals that guide us in domestic life to the way we deal with even our enemies. The Lieber Code is the basis of all international humanitarian law. It's basically just a handbook that was given to Union officers on how to treat the enemy and civilians. But it becomes the basis of and begins to influence other things. America is part of a liberal revolution that gets going in the middle of the 19th century. The same revolutions that Leutze was trying to paint. The Lieber Code is a big statement in that. It's not accidental that exactly at the same time, the United States is leading creation of the world's first universal membership international organization in the International Postal Union, which is dedicated to the idea that you can't solve your problems all by yourself. You have to work with everybody else. You have to make deals, you have to make compromises, you have to create consensus. And above all, you create institutions and norms. If you do that, the world does become a better place. And it's exactly the same time the first Geneva Convention is being created. All of this is directly related to an American idea. It's an optional idea because we're not interacting consistently. Consistent interaction starts with the war with Spain. That's where I was heading before. The war with Spain, the history of it, you know the general outlines. The conquest of the Philippines turned out to be the stickiest problem. We hadn't thought it through very well. We kind of just went out and did it. That was Teddy Roosevelt at his wildest. And suddenly we had this enormous problem on our hands. Philippines is a big country. Even then, as today, its population is about 1/3 that of the United States. It's not small. It's not insignificant. What's going to happen to it? And what's America's relationship to it? The cartoonist gets at this. Is America going to become a country like any other great power? Are we a country with national interests? Do we assert for ourselves? Or do we act for others? The cartoonist is torn. The cartoonist is profoundly ignorant. They tell you right there, they don't have a clue what a Filipino looks like. They don't care. They don't really care that much. The issue is much more about the United States than the Philippines. It's unresolved. So there's struggling here. Is America a liberator or is it a conqueror? Do we have self-interests? How do we best pursue America's relationship with the world? That actually gets resolved through the work of Woodrow Wilson. There's his short resume I give you. Wilson was absolutely amazing. You know, he starts out as a political scientist. Good man. He writes a book 120 years ago on why American government is so awful. And that's how he first gets noticed. Gets a job teaching at the College of New Jersey, as it was called. Under his tenure as president, it will become Princeton University, of course, and then through a series of small miracles. First, he becomes governor of the state of New Jersey, barely has that job at all, when the three men who should have become president, elected in the year 1912, Taft, Roosevelt, and William Jennings Bryan, all basically disqualify themselves, and he sort of becomes president. It's a national accident. And there he is. And he has one heck of a problem on his hands. World War has broken out. It's hideous. And above all, he has to keep America out. Things keep happening that draw America in. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 is a brutal shock. It's a sign that America can isolate itself from the war. But he gets reelected in 1916 on the plank of keeping America out of the war. The difficulty really becomes serious in 1917 with the Russian Revolution. Russia's out of the war. Germany is suddenly fighting one half of the war it was fighting just before. It's able to concentrate all of its forces on the West. The West is going to lose. Germany is winning in 1917. It's just a matter of time. And for the United States, this is an enormous problem. If Europe is unified under the rule of one dominant power, then Europe will create the resources enough to create a navy that directly threatens the security interests of the United States. That doesn't work. The American people aren't ready for that. Don't accept it. Don't believe it. How do you get America engaged in a global struggle? He says something radically different. The 14 points which put his thinking together are addressed partially to the world and partially to the American people. Why does America fight? To make the world a better place. Wilson is the man who figured out the way you get the United States engaged is not by doing the works of great powers and self-interest, but rather by pursuing great principles, by transforming the world. That's why America does foreign policy. And he puts it together. Foreign policy, he says, is primarily not about self-interest, but about principles. That's how you evaluate policy, and those are the goals for which you pursue it. Peaceful change, he says, in the world comes through institutions and norms. And you have to build those up. And then you do begin to change international politics. Wilson will have a profound effect. The entire world is amazed he hears the message. In 1919, there is one hero in the world, and it is that man. Everyone else is tired, is clapped out from a war effort that no one believed in anymore, certainly not at the end, and Wilson is the breath of fresh air. Wilson comes in with a message that people around the world believe in. He's the hero of the day. War, then, is to be repudiated. Why do you fight wars? And we all believe this. You fight wars primarily in order to create peace. That is a new message. That is a Wilsonian message. Wilson is the one who said that you fight wars in order to spread democratic values, to spread specifically American values. Not because you have to, but because that's the only thing that's sustainable over time. And he is the one who said that the reason you fight wars is to create institutions that will make it unnecessary, or at least possible to avoid that danger in the future. Thus the Treaty of Versailles, which was an effort to transform the world. Didn't work. Didn't work amongst other things because the American people rejected it. So it's a nice cartoon. There's Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, who has just killed the Treaty of Versailles, walking his victim out of the Senate. Why was the Versailles Treaty killed in the United States? Above all, because it meant doing foreign policy, and we weren't ready for it. It meant permanent engagement with the world. We weren't ready for that. It would have meant a less sovereign U.S., and that sounded very, very strange. Above all, it just doesn't seem essential. We weren't thinking ahead. You know, there's a whole argument to be made that America contributed to World War II. Not in the same way other countries and leaders contributed to it, to be sure. But America wasn't active, wasn't willing to play the role that it had to play. And there's something to that. Wilson was a failure, and yet he was an incredible success. America goes into World War II fully believing in the 14 points. We fight a Wilsonian war. Norman Rockwell, you can argue as to whether or not he was a great artist. He didn't think he was a great artist, but he had extraordinary insights. Why do you fight? And this is a painting, it's a magazine illustration that he's done. He tries to capture it, and he's put it together extraordinarily well. Any American looking at that immediately understands what it's all about, understands the purposes that it implies. Why do you use violence? To do good. Nothing else is defensible. The illustration, you have to stare at it a while. It begins to make some sense. The town name, there's a hint of it up at the top. It leaves you no doubt where in the world this scene is happening. You know who she is, roughly. You know who he is, roughly. He's an officer. The weapon is evidence he's the officer. He's about 30 years old. It's not the first time that he's fed a 5-year-old. What's America fighting the war for? In order to do that, that is the whole point of the enterprise, of course. But that comes with expectations. There will be some kind of reciprocation. And the intentions actually may be a little bit more complicated than that. Think the painting through. How did he get in that situation? The odds are he was involved in the death of her father. Forget that part. But concentrate back on the Wilsonian message, the nicer message. So America enters a world after to transform it. That is familiar. What are we doing in creating the liberal post-war order? The liberal order, because it's above all about avoiding crises of the past. It's about avoiding another Great Depression. How do we do that? It's about preventing another world war. How do we do that? We want to expand American values, American power, and we understand we have to make an investment, sacrifices, if you will, to do that. What's it all going to look like? This is the great creation. The post-World War II liberal order, which is extraordinarily healthy to this day. The institutions are overwhelming, personified, best of all, by the Secretariat building of the United Nations in New York. Why is the UN in New York? That's part of the consensus, of course. That's part of American leadership. We create a whole world of international institutions. We go far beyond the Wilsonian vision. Basically, Washington crosses the Delaware and now crosses every possible ocean. With the creation of an international economic order, the Bretton Woods system, a trading order that will hopefully prevent future global depressions. An international organization that is designed to try and reduce tensions. Treaty organizations to provide security where it's needed and to ensure American commitments where you can. Later on, the Geneva Conventions, which strengthen humanitarianism in international affairs, arms control to further reduce tensions, and most recently, of course, free trade agreements, all trying to bind countries together. That's the Wilsonian project. And this was extraordinarily successful. But it was never the only voice. Keeping that consensus together was always hard. There was always politics involved. There were always trade-offs. There was always disputes and really bitter disagreement. Should we be doing this at all? Not everyone was persuaded. It's become very partisan since the 1990s. In the early 90s, the Republican Party begins to drift away from the liberal consensus. Parts of it start getting questioned. And so the Republican Party's attitude is a sort of pick and choose. What is it they like? What is it they don't like? The Democratic Party, its candidates generally fully subscribe to the liberal order. And even this is fairly manageable through the presidency of George W. Bush. Where it really begins to break down, of course, is with the election of President Trump. Because for the first time, you have an American president who rejects the basic principles of that order. So things become, well, broadened in terms of possibilities, obviously. New things become possible, and we have to bring in older ideas. A set of ideas that go back to the election of Andrew Jackson as President of the United States in the election of 1828. Jackson lived a long life. As a boy, he fought in the Revolution. He lived long enough to get a photograph taken. In between, he did amazing things. At the Battle of New Orleans, that actually happened. There are many wonders of Andrew Jackson's life. One of them is he lived. He did things where he should have died. They were so dangerous, and he survives. That's a key to Andrew Jackson, of course. Jackson's presidency is associated above all with the repudiation of elite leadership. What's America all about? America is about the common man. Although certainly nothing common in the least about him, he becomes the advocate of the common man, the Westerner above all. Daniel Boone, as it were, painted here by Bingham. Daniel Boone, in this famous painting, is a huge painting, that's a small part of it, is leading the first band of white settlers through the Cumberland Gap in 1775, at the time of the Revolution. And it's interesting to study the painting. Daniel Boone is absolutely resolute, but he's also a little bit scared. They're surrounded with darkness. They know the path. He's found the path. They don't know what's going to happen. The dog hears something. The common man, represented by Daniel Boone, is the guide. Is the guide to all things, including how you're going to deal with the rest of the world. It's an idea that's more familiar to you and I from a barely adequate TV show from the 1960s, but certainly conveyed. Daniel Boone, by the way, is someone who can solve any problem you give him in 45 minutes with commercial breaks. That is not accidental. Hold on to that thought. So what you have here is a sort of Jeffersonian idealization of the yeoman farmer. Who is an American? Not the Virginia planters, like Jefferson, not the merchant businessmen of New England. Your ideal American is a common man, uneducated, unsocial, but also uncorrupted. And those are the people you turn to for leadership, says Jefferson. Predominantly Southern, obviously overwhelmingly Protestant, increasingly Western. And what are their values? Well, their values are populist. They're all about, as it were, opposition. And what are they opposed to above all? Well, they're social betters. They're opposed to Virginia planters, to New England merchants, to college professors, and to anyone with too much money. To be a populist is above all to be in opposition. That's how populism defines itself. It doesn't know what it's really for. They're for each other. They're for themselves. But really it's what they're opposed to that's most clear. And that's universal with populism everywhere. Populism is an opposition philosophy. It even works perfectly well for Turkish populism. Legitimacy, from this point of view, belongs to the common man. The common man's opinions are legitimate. They're real. They're serious. Everyone else's opinions are put on and ultimately flexible and can be ignored safely. Where does the common man go for a basis for action on the two things that they have? They don't have education. They don't have a lot of benefits. They have emotion and they have experience. Oh, we have a common synonym that we often use for the combination of emotion and experience. Anyone? Don't try too hard. Decisions based upon emotion and experience. Common sense. That is what common sense means to us. Common sense then becomes the basis of the way you guide yourself. It is obviously a conservative approach. You haven't experienced the future. Therefore, anything based upon experience has to be conservative. Simple as that. So it's a conservative philosophy. It's anti-education because it doesn't understand it. because to respect education means you start creating hierarchies, you create an elite. Popular media reinforces this overwhelmingly because, I mean, they're trying to sell TV shows to get people to watch them, so they'll buy, you know, borax soap, right? Who is the professor on American TV? Is bad. Is really bad. Ideally, the professor is the professor from Gilligan's Island. He was the comic relief on a comedy show. He was always had these amazingly highfalutin ideas that were totally irrelevant, and in order to resolve the plot of the show, you had to ignore him. And you were allowed to. It was fine. Life would go on. The nutty professor, he's dangerous. He knows so much that you have to ignore him. He must be controlled. Otherwise, he poses a danger. You're creating a populist idea. And again, television does this overwhelmingly. So what happens when you make a foreign policy out of this idea again? There's Jackson again, doing the impossible. He literally did that. He stood on the parapet with the bullets around him. The man lived and won. And he became incredibly influential. He did not do much foreign policy. No need. But the ideas become overwhelming. He primarily distinguishes in the world between his friends and his enemies. Based on that distinction, all kinds of things fall into place. If you distinguish friends and enemies, you can basically ignore all your friends, because they just want to be left alone anyway. And you must focus on your enemies. The main point of politics, the destruction of your enemies. Your enemies must be eradicated, because they're not really moral. You're a moral person. You're guided by your emotion and your experience. And these people are contradicting you. There's something wrong with them. So you have to fight them. Your enemies are a moral enemy. And the obvious thing to do is destroy them. This makes Jacksonians very suspicious of anything that leads to compromise with the other side. I mean, if you're making compromise with the other side, at a minimum, you're not destroying it. In reality, you're probably corrupting yourself. Diplomacy becomes very suspicious under this environment. The destruction of enemies, that makes a lot of sense. Jacksonian foreign policy is now back in an extraordinary way. That is not accidental. So President Trump in the Oval Office has moved a portrait of Andrew Jackson and put it directly at his left shoulder. This is making it very strong. There's a whole debate as to how that painting got there. I'm not going to go into it right now. It's very meaningful. The values of Jacksonianism in a big way. So you've taken this idea that says you deal with the world by emphasizing your own self-reliance above all. And that's the basis of your foreign policy, including in the White House itself. Jacksonians distrust others, especially people who don't share their exact experience. They're very distrustful. So the White House is enormously distrustful of anyone that wasn't appointed by the president. Even people appointed by the president get a pretty raw deal every now and then. So diplomacy must be done out of the White House. So essentially your foreign policy bureaucracy, I mean, they can stamp visa applications in Istanbul, I suppose. But that's about all you're going to let them do. Nothing else. Real diplomacy has to be done by these four people. It has to be done by National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, by Chief of Staff General Kelly, by the Secretary of State Tillerson, or Vice President Pence. And if they don't do it, you're not going to trust it. You're not going to take it seriously. As a net result, you cannot do very much diplomacy. There isn't people to do it. And it's not happening very much. The immediate effect is America's pulling out of liberal institutions. The president has made very clear his profound distaste for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal. He hates it. How does he get out of it? He doesn't know how to do it. That's the big difficulty. But he'll think of a way. I mean, the outlook for the Iran deal is poor. The negotiations to pull out or fundamentally modify NAFTA, of course, that's underway. The United States has not actually withdrawn from the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, because the terms of the agreement make it really hard, but we will. There's no doubt we're pulling out of that. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, TTP, was an enormous free trade area with 12 countries the United States put together as a counterweight to China in the Pacific. We have pulled out of that. The other 12 are going ahead with it, but not with the United States. We've left UNESCO, symbolic purposes. Other negotiations are in real trouble. The World Trade Organization is in very serious trouble right now. Through some curiosities in the World Trade Organization agreement, the United States can basically freeze the whole organization, make it impossible for it to function. That's why I said the liberal consensus has ceased to be a consensus. And yet, ironically, liberal ideas continue. Wilsonian ideas are a big part of American foreign policy. Democratization, human rights, American values diplomacy, that survives. Mostly, though, it is targeted against American enemies. So you've taken Wilsonian values and you've got a Jacksonian figure implementing them. How does he do it? Values and norms are what you use on your enemies. So that's the basic thrust in that, which is this interesting compromise. We can talk about that. Here's the biggest compromise on liberal values. Every single one of the greatest diplomatic achievements of the current administration have happened in the UN, without exception. Above all, the North Korea resolutions reported out of the Security Council. So they keep going back to the UN as a place to get things done. Why that is probably very peculiar. It's probably not sustainable. It does show you there's some basic importance in those institutions. And it also illustrates a larger problem that I'll close on. And go back here, not to Leutze's Washington Crossing the Delaware, but to rather this amazing work, which is less well known. Tojetti was an Italian who had just come to the United States to live. He was an extraordinarily accomplished artist, obviously. And here he shows the chariot going in the other direction. It's going west. This is all about continental conquest, but it's about a way that America deals with the world. Tojetti here shows the spirit of liberty. She's wearing the Fijian cap, so you know who she is. And she's in this chariot, and that thing is ready to go. It's extraordinarily powerful. She doesn't control that chariot. The world doesn't know where America's going, because America cannot know, because America doesn't control the chariot. But there she is, surrounded with a few goddesses, and there she demurely gets ready to ascend into the chariot. She doesn't know where it's going to lead her. No one viewing the painting can know where the chariot goes. Well, we have the advantage of history. And if you get a chance, go to the Oakland Museum, the Oakland Museum of California. There it is. It's quite the achievement. Where is America going to go? The world doesn't know, because America has fundamental choices. Wilsonian, Jacksonian, other possibilities, it's very hard to say. It's been a treat to start off this series talking about the American defense budget and national security. And it's an equal treat, an honor to be here wrapping up. I know you want something more conclusive. I'm not foolish enough to offer it, but I'll try and respond to your questions.
I think I'm going to marry this man. It takes us, across the Delaware River, out west, into the world, contrasts American values with the possibility of realizing America's national interest. What more could you ask for? Let me start out, though, by asking you a question about the first painting. It isn't clear to me that the current administration knows where the Delaware River is. I am not sure who is in the boat. I'm not sure they're heading anywhere. What would the world look like if we really have to think about America's disengagement?
Go to the next one. Oh, that's good. You're asking that because you don't know the answer. We talk foreign policy, like, 14 hours a day. So, if you don't know it, ergo... No, I don't know. And that's why I present possibilities, options. The foundations of foreign policies, multiple policies. The world never... Dealing with the United States is very difficult for the world. Countries don't know what they're going to get. Imagine, what happens when Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, calls up to her American counterpart, who doesn't like her. What's she going to get as a result? She doesn't know. The whole world has that problem to some degree. And it always has. America has always been somewhat unpredictable. One of the reasons why there's so much affection in the world for the post-war liberal consensus is it made for an extremely predictable order. And it certainly benefited the United States enormously. But countries put up with that because they felt they generally benefited themselves. Now, that order itself doesn't command the same stature that it used to. So the world confronts a huge unpredictability problem. To some degree, the world is adjusting. Throughout Europe, you have a debate about what should be Europe's relationship with Russia. Populists in Europe generally favor closer relations with Russia. That's part of adjusting to American unpredictability. In Southeast Asia, countries are adjusting as well. They're finding ways to deal with China. Other regions, countries are becoming more assertive. The rise of Turkey is largely about the decline of that same liberal post-war consensus. Turkey's doing its own thing. And there's a little bit of controversy there, obviously, as well. Every country is going through this same debate because the foundation is increasingly weak.
I'll accept that. I'm sure you have questions. They're over there in the corner.
Imagine a world where Wilson's points allowed the Kurds independence, which he had promised their own nation state. Then, of course, he got sick, and the French and the British took over the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, giving us the modern Middle East. That's all current history, as history goes. But my question to you is, whose foreign policy should we be seriously looking at? Kirchner, Trump, or the State Department?
We don't have foreign policy, we have inertia. And the inertia is developed out of events in recent years. There's a reason why Aaron Stein was referring to the continuities between Obama administration and Trump administration policies of the United States in the region. Those are not accidental. So I don't see an awful lot of flexibility, especially if you rely upon institutions, because institutions don't do flexibility. We associate that with leadership. The big difficulty we confront right now in the United States is we have very assertive leadership, and we don't know how meaningful it is. So, everybody in the world is dealing with the tweet phenomena and trying to figure out how much it matters. H.R. McMaster, the President's National Security Advisor, in responses to questions and answers at a conference 2 weeks ago, said, ignore the tweets. Which is very similar to saying, ignore the leadership. And that's what the man's saying about his boss. So we're in a very awkward moment. And, Mrs. Karp, she did a good job a long time ago. And one thing, she didn't raise a son who was going to respond directly to a question like that.
Any other comments, questions? Yes, please.
Hard question to even put together, but world leadership is a hard thing to maintain forever. Go back to Great Britain, Spain, etc. in history. Times seem to be shifting, or are they?
Yeah, globalization is absolutely transformative. The rise of Turkey is a direct result of globalization. The same force that's responsible for the rise of China, for the rise of Brazil, for the rise of South Africa and Nigeria. It's an enormous equalizer. The liberal consensus of the post-war period was predicated upon American economic dominance, of course, which made it possible relatively easily for the United States to win allies and support for its projects. But that was predicated on the assumption that the country with 4% of the world's population had initially 50% of the world's wealth. Now it's down to, closer to like 20% of the world's wealth. It's still pretty amazing. But the rest of the world is getting a lot richer. The disparities are going down everywhere. There are a lot fewer poor people out there. And there are a lot fewer uneducated people out there. The world, every place is getting much more similar in a lot of ways. One reaction to that is populism, which tries to stress the differences. The whole world's getting similar, so you build a politics that's based upon we're different. And that's how you get elected in a world where everybody's afraid of being the same. And so we're seeing that everywhere. How does the United States interact with that? That means the United States is going to have a lesser role regardless of what other countries specifically do. I mean, China could be a land of angels and it would still cause enormous disruption because it's big. It's got a lot of educated, increasingly wealthy people. So it's going to have a big effect. So is Indonesia. A country like Iran, which, Iran is, it's basically the same population as Turkey, for example. Very assertive. What happens when a country like that begins to take up space? Simply because globalization makes it really easy. That's a huge problem that we have to deal with. My preferred solution is you build institutions and norms. You build an international system where everyone is invested in the same set of values. But that requires leadership. It requires dealing with populism in a way that's politically really hard. And obviously it's not happening right now. My hope is that we return to institutionalization and to norm building. But I'm not very optimistic at the moment.
Santo?
One question about, I missed the lecture on the defense budget, unfortunately. But this might be related to, because the US is engaged in the world with, mostly it's also with its military too. And in the Jacksonian view, how is the military seen? Is it like the diplomacy?
Yeah.
Is it anyone hurt in right now?
This is strange, yeah. Jacksonians love the military. I don't know if you've done this yet. Watch Monday Night Football. America loves the military. Jacksonian America loves the military. I mean, the president wants to have a military parade. Basically because this is the one institution that Americans have agreed upon, that we all like. And Americans are very comfortable with small-scale military action, we found out. There's a lot of that going on, obviously. Wilsonians are not afraid of it. They'll do it, especially at the small-scale level, if they can control it. Wilson himself took America into 3 wars. Wars with Mexico, World War I, and a war that he took America into the Russian Revolution. We fought in the Russian Revolution. So we're not afraid of using that. And that capability is still extraordinary. The defense budget increase that was approved 3 weeks ago, for the first year, that budget increase is equal to the Russian defense budget. Just the increase. It's a 12% increase. It's equal to the Russian defense budget. So there's a lot there to work with.
We have time for one more question. Yes, in the back.
Just one, maybe 3 questions. To what degree do you think Jackson...
Just speak up a little bit more.
To what degree do you think Jackson was disrupted and then associated to that Trump? And since you're a scientist, I'll ask you to kind of take the opposite conclusion, but is it needed?
To Trump supporters, he's a breath of fresh air. Jackson was, exactly. He was going to transform Washington. He was going to be something totally different. he wasn't entirely different. I mean, what do we remember Jackson for? Above all, the Indian removals. The Indians, like the Cherokees, were forced off their land in the east and pushed primarily into Oklahoma. And he also ended federal monetary policy, federal investment policy. That's what he's really remembered for as president. The president also does something else. They set the tone of expectations. What is going to be the role of the federal government in solving problems? And my major concern on foreign policy with the Trump administration is I don't know how they want to solve problems. I don't think the president knows. And a lot of what here's the big difficulty. If he was repudiating things that we knew didn't work, that'd be one thing. He's repudiating things we know do work. He's repudiating them sometimes because he just wasn't involved in the process, sometimes because emotionally he doesn't connect with them, but above all because he's not invested in that post-war order. And that creates an environment of extraordinary unpredictability. And that too is always something to be concerned about.
To those of you who have steadfastly come out every Saturday morning for the past 8 weeks, thank you very much. If you have enjoyed the series, tell your family, friends, neighbors, almost like the same church, bring them in. And we look forward to welcoming you back a year from now. Thank you very much.